the critical role that the natural world plays in game design and gameplay, and why it's important to treat it as an active participant rather than just a backdrop. My name is Jeeyon Shim. I use she, her pronouns. Who else would like to introduce themselves?
I'm Meguey Baker, and I also use she, her pronouns.
And I'm Jason Morningstar. I use he, him pronouns.
Awesome. Shout out to Steve Rodebach, who's doing all of our tech stuff for us. This would not go without him. And if you have any questions that you'd like to ask any of the three of us or any combination of the three of us, throw them up in the Twitch chat room and he will pass them on. So again, thank you for joining us. The reason why I wanted to pitch this panel in the first place is because I have several year background in outdoor education. It's a formative passion in my life. And it's actually also the way that I got introduced to game design. It didn't seem super typical initially until I started making friends and getting to know people. And then I met a lot of people with various backgrounds in outdoor work, field work. And it seems like it is really influential in the work of a lot of people I've come to call my friends and look up to as peers and designers. So the first question that I'd love to just kick us off with is, what are our respective backgrounds in outdoor field work? What might people who know your work not know about that aspect of your life? Jason, do you want to start off?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So I don't have any professional experience as a guide or a outdoor field work kind of person. I had the good fortune of growing up in an avid outdoors kind of setting. My family's enthusiastic about that. And I was really uniquely positioned for a few years to be surrounded by National Outdoor Leadership School guides and other people who were excited about the outdoors, who would take me on difficult and remarkable trips in South Central Alaska for about 5 years. So I got out and did a lot. And I also worked in outdoor retail at that time. So there was a 5-year chunk in my life where not only was I getting out as often as I could in a really great place to paddle and hike and climb, but I was also advising other people in a way that I took very seriously, because it's a pretty unforgiving environment, and were I to advise them wrong, they could die. So that's sort of my thing. Also, I'm an amateur historian, and I've always really been interested in the sort of the interplay of the way the land shapes human experience. So that's me.
Awesome. I similarly had a very sort of outdoor childhood. I grew up until I was 12 in very rural upstate New York. And then I moved to San Diego, which is a big city and total culture shock. But one of the things that really influenced my life is that when I was 20, I had been through 46 of the 48 states. We really had a focus on seeing the natural world, go everywhere, look at things, just as a family. And it wasn't just drive over or fly over. It was you need to go and be in the spaces and see them. I was very woodsy always as a kid, and past, not this year, of course, and not last spring, but for the 6 years before that, I have been the lead adult support person on a week-long outdoor LARP intensive for the local middle and high school, 7th to 12th grade. So that is a hard and fast intersection of outdoor skills and game design work, where we're absolutely shaped in our play from what outdoor resources we have available to us, where we are. I mean, if there's water, great, we'll use water. If there's woods, great, there are woods here in our outdoor play world. So a lot of that. I also was an EMT before I had kids. I also have a little bit of that wilderness stuff, but never in an advisory position like you were, Jason. And there's a whole bunch of things for me about just living in New England currently, because the natural world always has things that are challenging about negotiating with it, but might be cold enough out to kill you. When you literally could die of exposure if you don't take care of yourself. It just makes it a little more visceral for me. Old houses, and I work in old museums, and very, very much aware of the effect of natural processes always. So that's where I come from.
What about you, Jeeyon?
Yeah, I'll get into it in a second, but really quickly, Meg, like, don't you also do some kind of like outdoor museum work as well, like artifact recovery or something like that?
Yeah, so there's several different, that's a great question, yes. There's several different parts of the museum work that I am involved with that are either current archaeological dig sites, often with children. Often, there's one that happens every year that is about cleaning up the Connecticut River watershed. And so the 4th and 7th graders spend a day pulling everything they can out of the water, which is great, as part of a really interdisciplinary approach to systems in the natural world. And then through the museums, it constantly comes up, particularly around Indigenous history.
It's just about
And
yeah.
yeah, so the Connecticut River is absolutely central to Indigenous story in New England. And so, as I am involved in local history, that is a huge piece of it, a huge piece of paying attention to how flood patterns expose objects and artifacts, and how erosion interacts with Indigenous sites, and what we can do in a professional museum capacity to hold on to that. Also with just like 17th century, 18th and 19th century sites as well. By the time you get into 20th century, it's usually pretty stable. But every time there's a giant flood or a hurricane or a fire or anything that is the natural world making itself extremely evident, there's an intersection of my museum work and my history work. I could talk a whole long time about that too.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I in the interest of time, I'll try to keep my background very brief. So I worked for 6 years as an outdoor educator. I taught mostly kids, but some adult courses as well, wilderness survival skills, mostly through LARPing and imaginative role playing. It was through a company that's local and also in Portland and a couple other remote sites. And it was actually, in many ways, my first introduction to being outside in a formal way. I'd never like really gone camping. I'd never really even gone to summer camp. But I hit a lot of firsts through that job. My first time camping, my first time sleeping out, like sleeping out on the ground, in a tent and then not in a tent, and then on a ground pad, and then with forage materials. Like it was my first time um, slaughtering a livestock animal. It was my first time learning about Western herbalism versus the herbalism I grew up with. All of these naturalist skills, like synthesized into this job that was about like how do you make kids excited to be outside in a sustainable way. And one of the values that was hammered into us as staff and mentors and teachers was how do you get kids to see their community as not just a group of people around them, but the non-human community as well. Right? The squirrel that always visits their yard, with like the nub tail, the crows they see on their way to school, all of the animals that we saw, all the plants, right? Like they recognize trees in their yard as like the climbing tree or the reading tree. All of these are part of their community as well. And
Yeah.
in many circles, that might seem like a really hippy dippy idea. I totally own and acknowledge that. But I really strongly believe that there's that's like critical to not only understanding our place in the world and our part as individuals in a species that's like part of a huge network, but also as game designers and players. Every time we talk about group integration or holistic play or how to facilitate a game better, how to just make your game table more fun, I think about that, the like human and non-human community. And I think about how much of my work starts from there and starts with integrating like literally the physical place you are as the starting point of your play experience. And everything that entails. So while I could go into all of the really cool, glamorous details about, you know, a job, that was really one of the coolest jobs I've ever had. At the same time, that's almost not the point. The point is, how do we teach our peers and people who are both new to games and also been doing it a lot as players or designers to recognize their own capacity for this kind of connection with the land around them? And then how do they integrate that in a way that benefits the community as a whole? And to that end, I would love to ask both of you, what games have we written? And we can talk about our own games, we can spotlight each other's games. What games have we written where the outdoors play a pivotal role, whether in mechanics, character, tone, or something else? And Meg, I'd love to hear you start.
I wrote a whole cycle of games, Playing Nature's Year, which is really in ways my love letter to living in New England. And every single one of those games is incredibly grounded in living in New England. You know, what's going on in the natural world? What are the stars doing? What are the plants doing? What are the animals doing? What foods are relevant to this? And one of the games in there, actually a couple games in there, but there's a game in there that is specifically about going for a walk. You know, you take some dice and you go for a walk and you use the dice as determiners for whether you're going to turn left or right or continue on your current path. And there's bits of, you know, by the dice roll, now is when you stop and have a drink of water. And by the dice roll, now is when you stop and have a snack. And by the dice roll, now is when you stop and really like meditate for a moment of like, wow, what is the space here and where have I arrived? That integration moment of when the game and the natural world overlap. And that's like, think, you know, it's called Ramble in the New Mown Hay. And it's just this little walking game. And I think that's definitely the game of mine that is most right on the nose about the intersection of the natural world and play. But I also am very much reminded of 1001 Nights, and the reason for that is because something Jeeyon said about the way that awareness of the natural world is part of your gameplay and part of your game design also is about broader systems thinking. And that you're not just thinking about what are we doing on the paper, you're thinking about, okay, what is the light like here? What am I smelling? What is the physical space like? How do we move in this physical space? And how that directly impacts the kinds of experiences we can have. And that is absolutely a game design component for me, and is like identical for me with bushwhacking through woods that I don't know that I've never been through before, and I don't know where the buried holes are or water or wires, and you know I've got to be careful and very, very aware. And that aspect of game design, I think, is part of what, or that aspect of experience in nature and awareness of natural surroundings is part of what informs 1001 Nights and other game design that I've done, where I'm paying a lot of attention to what else is in the room. You know, not just the people and the paper and the dice, but what else is in the room.
Wow, thank you so much. I'm gonna throw it over to Jason now too. I'd love to hear about some of the games that fulfill this function for you.
I think I may come at it from a slightly different point of view. One thing that what you just said, Meg, that reminded me is that many of these things are designable surfaces. So time and light are designable surfaces, right? So I have a game called The Skeletons where at various points in the game, you turn the lights out and sit in silence for up to 5 minutes. And sitting in a room for 5 minutes in total darkness with a group it's a long time. It gives you a real different perspective on on just sort of the embodiment that you're experiencing. So it doesn't directly correlate to talking about the natural world, but it does, I think, lead in that direction, right? Paying attention to the space around us. I when we started talking about this, I thought about some of my games, and I realized that in many cases, the natural world is a focus of oppression in my games, which I think is interesting and something I need to think about. I've got a LARP called The Climb, which is about an illegal ascent to on a mountain in Bhutan, and the landscape is absolutely there to be exploited and conquered very deliberately, and it's built into the scenario that what you're doing is wrong, but it's there, and I think that's an interesting. I don't know. Maybe it's not interesting, but it's certainly a commentary on my experience mountaineering, right? Where the landscape is often seen that way. I've written games that in that same vein, games where the natural world is unknowable or outside your experience. I wrote a role-playing game called Durance, where the world is described as an environmental failure state. You collaboratively create an environment that is unsustainable and unsurvivable by whatever you're making choices, but the end result will always be an environment that's implacably hostile to human life. Uh, which again, like think about what you're doing, Jason. But, so there are two examples. I could go on, but I'll stop there. How about you, Jeeyon?
Oh gosh, I mean, given kind of my starting point in design, which was initially as an arm of this company I worked for before I started doing my own independent stuff. Like I can't. It's hard to think of an example of one of my games that doesn't use the natural world in some capacity.
Can I ask you to
I'm
talk
trying
about
to
one in
think of.
particular?
Yeah, yeah.
Can you talk about the Witches Cottage?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's actually maybe my favorite game of my own that I've written. Unfortunately, it is not available for sale anywhere because I don't know how to make it possible to play in pandemic conditions. But The Witch's Cottage, for a very brief summary, is sort of a story told in three parts. You embody four characters with only two players. So each player gets a chance to play two different people in this story. You start off as a witch with their apprentice. You know the witchfinder is coming for you, and the game's mechanics are about you trying to figure out how to convince the other to let you sacrifice yourself. The second part is whoever is the sacrifice in their interrogation with the witchfinder. It's the most intense bleak part of the story. And then the third part is whoever survived is now many years later living at first alone and now with a novice that they've decided for the reasons you'd create in character development to train as well. And so it's a story about things that happen to you and then surviving through them and then how you continue the cycle and legacy. But the natural world is very present in it in the language I use. The mechanics themselves initially were all centered around a bowl of water, and then I had to change it to stones. In the first act, you're like arranging stones as like a magical, like talismanic chore. And the second one, the stones are actually placed on the player's body to represent every time something happens. An oblique way of referring to real physical oppression and torture that happened to people who are accused of being witches. And then in the third act, it's used as a method of healing, like magical healing. Um, and ideally, those stones or that water is actually brought in from the outside. These games have only been played in convention spaces, which is kind of wild to me. Really borderline, not sterile, but certainly maybe a little stale indoor spaces, some of which don't even have windows. And it it stems from getting my start in game design, which was like my job was to literally get people interested in going outside, knowing that that was the physical space that they would be playing in. So how do you do that? And it's very intuitive to me to figure out ways to bring the outside in.
Mm.
And so yeah, that's a great example. The Witches Cottage. I have no idea when or how I'll publish it, but I would really, really like to. I really enjoy it. And then
I have ideas.
yeah, and then I'm trying to think of another game that's like my own that really is like that, but is dissimilar. But actually, I'd love to highlight other games of yours that like struck me that weren't mentioned. So Meguey, actually, Under Hollow Hills, similarly, while you're not literally outside, there takes a lot of aesthetic from the natural world.
Yeah.
I noticed, like the language, even the archetypes that you play are very much based in like a Celtic mythology, but also like that is itself animistic, right? It's in the land,
Mhm.
plants, animals, weather patterns. And then Jason, I was gonna say the Isabel, right? Like the counterpoint to Dead House,
Oh,
actually.
yeah, yeah.
So I
Mhm,
mean, like talk
mhm.
about brutal, but also like that's a part of the natural world too, right? Like I think there's a way to write about it that doesn't always make it gentle or embracing. Like our unofficial motto at work used to be nature doesn't give a fuck about you, and it wasn't supposed to be like punitive. It was just like a stated
It's,
fact, right?
yeah,
Like
it's just true. It's just true. Yeah.
and I think that that's a really important part of understanding and integrating that play, because if you're hosting a game outside, right? Like I've hosted a lot of LARPs outside with a lot of players along a wide range of capacity to be outside safely. Um, how do you steward that experience without causing great risk of physical harm, not just to you,
Mhm.
but also to the space that you're in, right? Which is an equally large fear as someone I'm
Come
teaching
here.
like
Come here. Sorry, I
um,
have a bit of natural world intruding. It's okay, Jane. Come here. Kitty, kitty, kitty,
um,
kitty. Okay.
so and someone else a question. So yeah, I think for anyone who's watching, I would love to go through like the bibliographies of game designers you like, and look for the games that they've written probably that also reflect the natural world, and kind of what you can tell about their perspective of interacting with it from what they've written, because I guarantee many game writers in this indie scene are absolutely influenced by nature and the outdoors.
Yeah.
And it may not
I have a
be
question.
obvious. I'm sorry, go ahead, Meg.
Oh, please. Go.
I
No,
was just
you go
gonna
first.
say that, that those themes might be buried, right? Or they might be oblique within a particular work. But that's all.
I think it's a really
Sure.
important point, though, because one of the things about like you have to, you know, find ways to interact and engage at all different levels and all different places, and not everybody can do a week-long hike in the Sierra Nevadas to
Right.
be in nature in that way. And having something like Isabel or Under Hollow Hills or the Witches Cottage that they play at a convention and draw from that, because as we are all part of the natural world, we can find ways to meet everybody where they are. But that stealthy piece, like I love knowing that like in the climb, nature doesn't give a fuck, and you're not supposed to be there, and it's kind of out to get you. That is grand. I love that, even if it's not super. Some of our games say things stronger on the cover than they uh, games are more forthright with what is going on within them, and some aren't. But I want to hear about, if we have time, do we have an hour or half an hour? Where are we at with that?
We have an hour, so we have about 5 minutes left.
Oh, yay, good. Okay, because I wanted to ask about like formative moments, because there's a formative moment, or a moment that I uh, come back to over and over in game design that involves my experiences in nature. And my like formative moment that is so clear to me is being in high school, being in a tent in the Anza Borrego Desert in Southern California, in the summer, and the wind on the tent just going whoop, 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 whoop. So annoying. Could not sleep. Frustrating. Beautiful warm night, but I'm in this tent and it's just making this annoying sound. And as soon as I went out of the tent, this tent was where I was supposed to be human, right? This is my little space where this is where I'm supposed to be, in a tent. And as soon as I went out of the tent, it was like this totally quiet, beautiful, all the stars in the universe right there. And the breeze was just like enough to keep it beautifully cool to sleep. And it was this, I mean, I have this physical reaction right now of like, because that was a moment that I still go back to, of a time pushing getting myself out of my own head, getting myself out of what I thought was my comfort zone, and that that specific experience in is so integral. And I think what Jason just said, it's stealthy. I don't even really think I was this moment. It might have been this conversation that I became aware of, like, oh, that moment. To experience something else, to experience this in a different way, is very much part of game design. So do you have a similar moment that you can point to, or like, this is an experience in nature that shapes you in some way like that?
Yeah, I think I do. Shall I share?
Please, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so for me, one of the things that has really shaped my experience as a designer is the idea that the thing that you're making has a voice, and it's going to tell you kind of what it wants to be, which is sort of similar to how sculptors often think about their work. And I really think this is true. And I know it sounds a little out there, but I think your work speaks to you and can guide you if you listen to it. Um, and I'm pretty sure I learned that in the natural world, where, as we have established, it does not give a fuck, and you are going to adapt to its demands, right? Um, that's just the way it is. And I can give very concrete examples of that, but I think we all can attest to the fact that we're a very minor player, and in a much bigger ecosystem, and that we're going to conform to its requirements, and learn what it wants from us, I guess, is the second piece to that. So that's I guess what I would say about that. My examples are sort of traumatic, so like
Got it.
they're
Yeah,
they're hard learned lessons.
yeah.
Anyway, I'm anxious to hear what you have to say, Jeeyon.
Sure. Yeah, I've got some hair bending stories too, but they always like cycle in and out of these like really quietly revelatory moments as well. And I guess to like bring it specifically to games, the first, I think the first LARP I ever wrote, because this was before I was a coordinator and program designer. The first LARP I ever wrote was for teenagers with an adult staff who were age peers with me. So no one was older than like, I want to say like 35. Most of the adult staff were in their 20s and early 30s, and the kids range from like 12 to 16. So we could push pretty hard with the themes. And I wrote a game that essentially was about like, I don't know, like colonialism, burn it down, without being like really heavy-handed about it. It was like a land-based fantasy game with druidic magic and an institutional magic. And this is a mechanic that's actually become a signature of mine in a lot of my work now. In order to cast any magic, you had to find something in the land, make sure it was safe to touch it, and then call upon an aspect of whatever you were touching to cast on the person. So like you could like grab a handful of ivy for a binding spell. And that was if you were from the witch clan. And then the institutional magic was about, instead of integrating yourself, you decided what your will was and then put the pieces in there to work it, with a lot of fallout after. And that's pretty, it's not subtle. Um,
It's not
it,
subtle to us.
no,
Yeah.
but the kids loved it. One of the things I was really worried about was some of the staffers had expressed some anxiety. There's one person who was actually like really hesitant to be outside. And she came up to me after the game and she was like, "Hey, I really want to go hiking. How do you do that?" And I was like, I don't know." And we just talked about it for a bit. And she goes, "I just want to thank you also because like I was kind of afraid to do this game because I don't really like being outside, but my character died the second I died. The wind passed through the glade that I was in and I saw a shooting star. I just had this moment where I was like, holy shit, we really are all connected. Like there's no division between us and what's out there." And it made me want to go for a hike for the first time in my life. And I feel like that's a really great thing. And that like blew my mind. Like this idea that through imaginative play, you could create your own connection, right? Because the connection's always there. You just have to recognize it. And that was extremely formative for me. I was like, fuck, I want to do this all the time. Like that's um then the other moments are like innumerable and in some ways smaller because they're with children, but they're, I hold each one of them in my memory very close to me. Like there was one day I had a group of second graders when I was still just an instructor, and they were like the group dynamic was just there was a lot of friction. I was like, how the fuck do I get them to chill out, right? Like it was Tuesday or Wednesday when the spike always goes up in their behavior, and so I was like, okay,
Hmm.
in a school of magic, which is not really combat or conflict based. So I was like, okay, guys, here's what we're going to do. Here's a bunch of herbs. I taught them the herbs. And then I was like, you are going to use this herb a little bit, but you have to wake it up. And so they would have to whisper like the story of like if they had a chamomile bud or something, they'd be like, you started as a seed and then you grew in the earth. And like they would have to wind the story out before they used it. And they were like sitting there with these dried herbs, like whispering into their hands, like at the edge of a creek. Lots of little moments where they actually decided to really engage with it. They were like, no, this is cool. I want to do this. And those moments when you realize, for me, just speaking for myself, that this thing that you don't want to get too preachy about, but it's so hard not to, but like you really want to hammer it home when it actually works and you've done like minimal leading, it feels like, and people just get there on their own. It's like such a vindication that like it's true that it's just a door that's always open and people just forget. Um, and all of those moments are extremely like important to me, every single one. So
Really
yeah,
beautiful.
thank you.
I think th- can I add a little bit to that? 'Cause
Um,
there's a
yeah, in the interest of time, just because we're over half an hour at this point, and I want to
okay.
get to some of the people's questions. I just
Oh,
want to keep an
sure.
eye on the clock. But yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I'll do it in 10 seconds or less. It's authentic experience. You know, authentic, like this, I am experiencing a real thing. You know? That's that moment. Um, and it's I love what you just said, that it's always available to us, but we sometimes forget that we can experience a real thing. Um, and then the quick thing, COVID-19, outside is where it's safe. My kids are sitting outside right now in the cold, um, 10 feet across from other friends over a giant fire built, because that is a way that they can be safe. And they have been to more extremes to figure out, how do we all be safe from this deadly virus doors in the cold or the heat or the rain, that they've endured more and they've discovered more. And I'm just, if there's a golden lining, that's it. Cool. That's all I had to say. Thank you.
So we've had some. It seems like we've had some really concrete examples, but I'm interested. I think I'm imagining that people watching this want to know how they can center their work in the natural world more, and also there might be the question, why is that even important? And I'd love to get both your takes on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd love to answer this question because I think I have my Twitch window open, and I think it actually touches on a question that game biologist asked about. I'll just read it out. Looking through your designs has helped me think about ways to help people make that connection, this land connection. And that connection is the reason I'm excited about work now. And then someone else asked, it's easy to see nature as a thing separate from human spaces. How would you suggest designing to put players in a game where anthropogenic nature is centered and places the players as part of that natural system? Um, that is, I'm so glad someone asked that question, because I really believe that one of the worst things to happen on an environmental justice level is concept of the natural world, period, right? Rather than just like a single biosphere that we all live in. The separation that happens linguistically, which immediately, just cascades into an emotional separation, a societal separation, a separation of priorities. Like you just, people intrinsically, I think, as they're raised, think of themselves as separate from the world around them. And so I think treating this almost like a logistical question, right? Like what kind of design techniques can you use? What strategies? For me, I like to think about like, how would someone living in like a landlocked suburb where you have to drive 15 minutes to get to a Target, and maybe there's like a park 10 minutes away, but it's very manicured. Like, how do they feel like the moments that we've had when we've been outside, right? You absolutely can't in that environment. And I think starting with this idea, which is very relevant right now in pandemic conditions, of regardless of what game you make, thinking about, where are people literally physically going to be playing this game? Are they going to be outside by a stream bed in the spring? Like, I fucking hope so, at least once in their life. But like, realistically, people who buy games in large numbers, they're going to be playing them at home inside. And in some ways, COVID is making it more apparent that like, if you want to be with people outside is best, right? But also realistically, you're going to be doing it the way we're talking now over Zoom. So what are some strategies that you two can think of to incorporate into the design aspect of it?
Something that immediately comes to mind is bespoke games, right? So like it's a game for this particular piece of landscape. Like this is a place we're going to play it, and it incorporates the features of this place, and it can't be played anywhere else. And I've experimented with that. I have a game that's done for a particular park near my house, but that I've never had a chance to play because the world fell apart. Um, but I'm hoping that I'll get a chance to. It involves.
I shout out.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, tell me about what that game involves. I want to hear about what that game involves first, and then I'll shout
Oh,
out a different title.
Oh yeah. It's called Rock Island, and it's there's a beautiful sort of mile-long trail in a forest near an experimental university forest near my house that leads to a river that has a big rock in the middle of it that you can access. And so the game is about a trip to that place, which in some sort of unnamed post-collapse future is where people meet, and you meet and you trade and you make whatever arrangements you're going to make for the year. So different groups of people come there, and that's what the game's about.
So cool.
I have
I think it'd be,
I literally I have that exact place like a 10-minute walk from my house. I'm like, I could play that game here. Like it matches
that's
up.
so good.
That is historically the purpose of that little rock island in the middle of the river. Like
That's super cool. Well, I'd be happy to share it with you.
So funny.
that'd be cool.
Yeah, out of the three of us, I'm actually the most apart from like what we think of as, again, like this false idea of like nature as an again, falsely untouched like tract of land somewhere. Like, I live in downtown Oakland in California, which is a very densely populated city. The natural world is all, it literally comes to my backyard, right? Like I sent a lot of friends, I think including you, Jason, an over enthusiastically captioned video of a Cooper's hawk that dropped its dinner on top of my recycling bin. And the reason I noticed was there was that huge thunk, and then I looked up and it was like 10 feet away from me, and it was so cool. That's a dramatic example, but like the pigeon that constantly fucks up your bird feeder, like that's still nature. Like your yard is nature. The weeds that grow up through the cracks in the sidewalk are nature. And I think, but I think Other game of yours, Jason, before I went on this tangent, is Darling Corey, which I've actually played. It's a game that you wanted to be played by a swamp. I was like, I know exactly the mosquito-ridden stagnant pool to play it at. And it was really cool. The way the game was written, the language, even the instructions, like for people who aren't familiar, because this is one of Jason's Patreon games, you have to cut out these like two-sided, like this happens or that happens options on a piece of paper, and then you let it kind of like twirl to the ground like a maple seed. And then whatever lands face up, that's what happens. And bespoke games are really interesting. I guess the question is how, like, when you make them, are you committing to like this is a game that really only can be played like by, I don't know if it was the Eno River you're talking about, but like this specific river.
Yeah.
Love the Eno. Yeah. Or is this something where people could find a place like it and then adapt it?
Yeah.
And that's like the piece of that I was wondering, like, because I think bespoke games is great, and I think that there's like a two-sided coin there. One is sort of like what Jeeyon just said. Here is a game that needs these components. You know, can you find an elevated place that's overlooking some water with a really cool tree and something man-made? Design a game for that. Awesome. You know, that would be cool. Also, the piece that I think, you know, games and education, which is something that, you know, we've talked about a little bit. There's also a desire to put forward that like you can go make a game. You know, go play a game. Why not? Why would you not go to your local? Why would you not go look at ants on the sidewalk? 40, 50, or 42-year-old person, go, you know, be engaged in nature in a way that is our birthright as part of a living natural world that we are part of. That's our birthright, to be engaged with nature and finding the ways that we can, if that's ants or birds out the window or get a house plant or, you know, any little way, really important. And I feel like there's another piece there, which is to not just engage with the pretty parts of nature. And I think that's one thing that Jason's games are really good about. And your Cooper's Hawk story, Jen, is really good about, because it's so easy, I think, for nature to either be just the pretty parts or just a backdrop to the action. And finding ways to have it not be that.
Something that's so important for me to say that is absolutely relevant to what you just said, Meg, is that I think we alternately fetishize and trivialize death, right? And we don't engage with it in our play. That's I think that's a shame, because games, you know, we promote empathy and embodiment as ways to understand things, but then we do this thing that I don't understand, where death suddenly becomes meaningless or disposable or lightweight in a way that is a disservice to living.
Yes.
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 Anyway, I could go off on a tangent about that, but I just wanted to get that out.
I think like space needs to be made for it. Like when I would LARP outside with kids, it's not unheard of. It was actually pretty common to find like a dead animal in the woods. It's the woods, and multiple times, like safely. Obviously, like the sanitary aspect of it was like a safety concern of facilitation. But once that safety concern was met, directly engage with it every single time. And part of my training actually was like, what happens if you find a dead animal? Like, make it part of your story. Like, teach kids that this is part of the cycle, and that like that animal in death is also going to ecologically be incorporated back into its ecosystem. And that like you don't have to say this part, but like with the implied like addendum, and so are we, right?
We'll figure it out. Kids understand.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
closed system, and you know what? Like, kids are not afraid of it. They would make these beautiful little altars with, like, fallen leaves. We would do, like, rituals for them to, like, help them in passing, but also sometimes we didn't make a big deal out of it. It was like, "Oh, yeah," and then we would move it and make, like, a little cairn or something so that we would know it was there and not accidentally, like, trample it while we were playing games, but, it was something that we always just looked at, and I think there are certain aspects that are just so emotionally hard for some people because they don't about it frequently that touch on death, but also touch on like existential questions, right? Like right now, one that everyone alive, I think, is grappling with to some degree is climate change and like the accelerating rate of it. And it's really hard to look at. It's very hard not to feel bleak about it. But in the same way as I think it's like kind of a disservice in role playing games to be like, death is something that's glossed over or only used as like a cheap narrative gambit or something like that. Like I think it's possible to look at these harder questions as well, in a way that can underpin the emotional core of a lot of the games that we write and the games that we're interested in, which ultimately are these emotional questions and interactions.
You find that the difficulty with them is something I feel like it comes with age. I feel like a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old will encounter birth and the natural world and death in a more way, much of the time than someone who's 15 or 25 or 45. I feel like there's a space that we go through where we become separated. We get that sense of separate from our food or our waste or our inevitable demise, or any of that. And it's a interesting process as game designers to figure out where we reincorporate that sense of connection, that we're bridging back into. So much I think of what we do as game designers is in a way trying to get back to when we were just being in the woods and being like, okay, cool, so I'm gonna be like this kind of wizard and you're gonna be that kind of wizard and you're gonna be that kind of wizard and we're gonna like build a wizard stick house,
Yeah.
and it's gonna be awesome.
Organic.
And a lot of our work, I think, is trying to get back there.
Yeah, like kids just intuitively start doing that the second they enter into those spaces with someone they want to play with, right? And we as adults need all kinds
I want to do that every day. Like every time I'm like, I see you at a convention and I'm like, let's go build a stick house. But we're in a convention. I'm like, pillow fort. But they get a little annoyed with you if you rearrange their furniture too much.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I think.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I was just going to suggest that we see if there's any questions.
That's literally what I was going to say. Is we're coming up on the 10-minute.
Same brain.
So it looks like there's actually just some organic chatting going on, which is very cool. I think we addressed and like folded in game biologist questions and Shiny Prince Ben's questions. And I'm going up. Oh, okay. So we touched on this obliquely, but I'd love to be like way more direct and tangible about it. Robo Wist asked, question that comes to mind as a result of Jeeyon's comment. I don't even know which one, but fine. Gaming over the past months has moved to the online environment, so we now have experiences which are more artificial in quite tangible ways. Our focus during game sessions is on the pixels on the screen. Any ideas about how we can design games that emphasize our connection to the natural world, but that remain playable in these pandemic conditions? That's such a good question. That's so.
It's a wonderful question.
That's a whole panel.
Yeah, right. That is like a whole panel. But I'd love to hear some brief ideas from you before I go in, just because I've been talking recently.
Well, turn your camera off. Focus on different things. That's where I'd start. It has the advantage of also being lower bandwidth, easier, more accessible. Anyway, that's my immediate thought was like, it's all these things are opportunities to use different senses. So use different senses.
I think that's brilliant. I think that's really, really brilliant. And it puts us in a place that connects us back thousands and thousands of years to telling stories together while we are doing something else. Because if I'm not needing to do this, if I could be sitting here, like also, I don't know, washing dishes or gardening or, advertising papers, whatever, it doesn't matter. It engages different parts of your brain because you have a physical active part, and telling stories together is so ancient. I think that's a really, really good tactic. I would also say that an option we have more because of technology is to move our physical location. Now, if I can go outside my cell phone and be sitting outside, or go for a walk while I've got someone on the phone that I'm like, okay, cool, we're now is the part in our game where we have to go a place. Let's all go a place. Even if we just walk around the block each where we are, it will change our game, and it will reincorporate aspects of the natural world in a way which we would never do at a convention. So that's pretty cool.
That's really good.
Really good. Yeah. And like my answer to this question, and thank you again for asking it, kind of ties what both of you have said together. Because my usual question when people ask in a non-pandemic context, my usual answer, is to say like go outside, right? Like literally leave your phone in your apartment or wherever and just go outside. But right now it's entering into winter. Not everywhere is Oakland, California, where today I think it was like a low of 64. And like it's not safe to go outside in places depending on the time of year. And so I think being able to again turn off your screen so that maybe you're literally even just looking out your window. It's so technical and practical, but it really does have an effect because if you're just hearing someone's voice, it actually makes the gameplay, I think, more intimate. And to also think about like what are ways that you can involve different senses into it, whether it's touch because someone's engaging in a physical activity as you're playing, whether it's scent. I've been talking to some designers who've used sense of smell in a really interesting way, taste. Like I've been using food and talking to Sharon Beeswass, who does a lot of like cooking and incorporates that into his design. Sound, like again, like being able to kind of create auditory experiences just by virtue of like instead of using this webcam mic and speakers, we're going to just use like the headphones with an inline mic and talk to each other where the audio quality is good and it's also like most of what you hear, right? Like there are ways that you can design to actually guide and dictate someone's sensory experience in a way that I think can also tie into these other things we've been talking about that is 100% remote. Because when we say COVID safe games, really what we're saying is remote games, right? With the exception of a couple where maybe like putting on a mask is and getting together outside is okay, but like generally speaking, it's all remote, right? Like,
Yeah.
We have one more question from Turnip Twinkle Toes. Nice. The example of Karen's and previous talk about museums makes me curious. How much do you draw inspiration from how people have interacted with nature throughout history, as well as nature itself? I'd love.
This is where I draw a big like 100% on the screen because nature and history and human history is like they're like this. Playing games and the natural world and human history is a basket in which we carry our culture forward. That's what that is. Yeah.
100%. Totally agree. I also just wanted to note that, Jeeyon, as the sun sets on the West Coast, you're becoming more and more vampiric.
It's exquisite. I just love it.
It's very good. It's very good.
The lighting doesn't, this is literally a light up globe. And like, depending on where I put it, it's either like kind of like a campfire glow or it's like, we're all about to die. So thank you for humoring that. Yeah, again, 100%. Like we all, our ancestry have a birthright to connection with the outdoors. And I think it would be remiss to not acknowledge that in the US, a lot of outdoor education and work with the land is done on the backs of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities because of the history that goes into land ownership and then access to land, as well as like the skills, like for me teaching wilderness survival skills, right? A lot of the skills that I was teaching, some of them are like very universal, but there are also some specific techniques. Like we would teach a trap called a Paiute deadfall. That's literally a tribe. And I think if you're interested, in that line of inquiry, it's very worthy to look at maybe like your own personal history and like going back, like for me, since I'm Korean, there's a lot of land skills that have to do specifically with being in the land in Korea. But also think about maybe like where you're living right now and what the history of interaction with the land and play with the land might have been, what artifacts it generated, what traditions it generated. And
I have another slant on it, which is about the ways in which the world since 1915 really has aggressively isolated itself from the natural fluctuation in temperature. The advent of air conditioning, I get like livid about air conditioning sometimes. It's a whole scene, but just allow yourself to be a little less comfortable. You know, go outside. You don't have to like, because Jeeyon, you're 1,000% right, and also a place where we put outdoor education is about specifically exercise for a certain physical form, and it has a militaristic overtones as well, and just let yourself be a little less comfortable. It's really okay. You're not gonna die of exposure if you go sit outside and get really sweaty or wet or cold. Be safe about it, but be out there. So the piece where looking to indigenous traditions for guidance, like with the right equipment and knowledge, you can very comfortably be outside in any weather if you have the right equipment and knowledge. And that's to a very, very, very wide range. I feel like that's an important piece too.
Yeah, this ties into one last question I'd love to answer in the last like minute or two that we have, which is Shiny Prince Ben asked, are there any books, podcasts, or other inspirational media about experiencing the natural world you would recommend? And my list is like very long, but I can touch on just like 2 or 3 that jump immediately to mind. One of them is a book called What the Robin Knows by a man named John Young. He founded the Wilderness Awareness School out in Washington. It's about how to recognize bird behavior through common backyard birds that people don't think of as glamorous, like a robin or a house sparrow or something. And in doing so, you learn about not just the bird, but like the entire ecosystem around it. Why does it freak out and fly up when you walk in, or your cat walks in, but not your dog, right? Things like that. What the Robin Knows is incredible. It was written for the layperson, so you don't have to have an academic background to get through it quickly. It was a bestseller, I think, for a while. Another one that is academic, but I think can be read pretty easily by someone who hasn't necessarily gone to a high level of school, is called Tending the Wild, which is about Pomo, Miwok, and Ohlone land management strategies in California, which is incredible because it talks about, like, that seems so specific, but it's actually like everything. And it talks about, among other things, why European agricultural practice drove a huge wedge between us and our connection with the world. I highly, highly recommend those 2 books as a starting point.
Do you have some stuff, Jason?
Oh yeah, I'd recommend John McPhee as an author generally, who writes about the land, and also indigenous ethnography and cultural history. So that exists for wherever you live. The one I recommend for the place where I sort of came of age is Shempete, Alaska, which is a cultural history of the Upper Cook Inlet, written by a guy who is a Denena Athabascan.
Awesome. I would recommend all of the children's books by Bird Baylor. It's Bryd is her first name. Baylor, I think it's Bayllor. Illustrated by Peter Parnall, and these are formative books about being part of the natural world. And I also think that as a role-playing game designer, holy crap, children's books, do the story, make it that's the story, so children's books about the natural world, and not just informative, like, here is the rock, but stories about the natural world. I would also, please God, go find a copy of Roxaboxen. It's a children's picture book, Roxaboxen, about children. It's an autobiographical children's story about growing up in the desert in the Southwest and being a kid in the natural world. Also, Dragon Scales and Willow Leaves. Please find that book about 2 different interpretations of being in the natural world. And I see little smiles in both of you, but so the whole range. I love everything that we've recommended, and I want everybody to read all of them.
This has been great.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, this was so great. We're a couple of minutes over, so we'll say our goodbyes now. And I'm sure if we have other recommendations, we'll put them up. And thank you so much for joining us here. Hang on, so you can actually. Hi. Bye. It was good to talk with you. Bye.